The roar of the crowd echoed across the massive stadium as thousands of fans cheered for their favorite team. The bright stadium lights illuminated the field, casting shadows of the players locked in fierce competition. Among the crowd was a man who stood out, not because of how he looked, but because of how he carried himself. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, with an air of quiet confidence, Marcus Johnson scanned the field with a sense of pride. This wasn't just any football game to him. This field, this team, this moment, it was all part of his journey, his dream, and his story. Marcus had always loved football. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, it wasn't just a sport to him. It was an escape, a passion, and a way to unite his community. But as a young black man, he quickly learned that the world didn't always see him for his dreams or potential. It saw him through a lens of assumptions, stereotypes, and imitations. Despite the odds, Marcus worked tirelessly, not just to succeed in life, but to create opportunities for others. Years of hard work had paid off. He wasn't just a fan in the stands tonight. He was the proud owner of the team on the field. But tonight, that didn't matter to everyone. As the second quarter neared its end, Marcus decided to leave his private box and join the crowd in the stands. He wanted to feel the energy of the fans, the heartbeat of the stadium he had poured his heart and soul into. Moving through the stadium, he greeted people with a smile and a nod, blending in as just another spectator, despite his tailored suit standing out in a sea of jerseys. He eventually made his way down to the edge of the field, where he could watch the game up close. That's when it happened. "Sir, you're not allowed here," a voice barked behind him. Marcus turned to see a stadium security guard standing rigid, eyes narrowing in suspicion. The guard, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, gestured toward the stands. "You need to go back to your seat. This area is for authorized personnel only." Marcus, taken aback, responded calmly, "I'm authorized to be here. I just wanted to enjoy the game from a closer view." But the guard wasn't having it. His tone grew sharper, more commanding. "I said you need to leave. Now, or I'll have to escort you out." A few people nearby began to notice the exchange. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and all eyes turned to Marcus. He tried to defuse the situation, explaining, "There's no need for this. I'm not causing any trouble. I'm the—" "I don't care who you are," the guard interrupted, his voice loud enough to drown out Marcus. "Rules are rules. Let's go." The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus stood his ground, his expression calm but firm. He wasn't one to make a scene, but he wasn't about to be disrespected in a place he had worked so hard to build. Yet he knew this moment was bigger than him. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about something deeper, something far too familiar. "Is there a problem here?" Another voice chimed in. A second security guard had joined the scene, his presence only amplifying the tension. Fans were now pulling out their phones, recording the interaction. The players on the field seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding just a few feet away, but in the stands, all eyes were locked on Marcus and the guards. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing. Should he explain who he was and risk seeming arrogant? Should he walk away and let them assume he didn't belong? Either way, the moment felt like a test, not just of his patience, but of his principles. The lead security guard reached for his radio, muttering something about removing a trespasser. Marcus's jaw tightened. Trespasser. In his own stadium, he wanted to laugh at the irony, but the situation was anything but funny. He knew this wasn't just about a policy violation or a misunderstanding. It was about perception, about how people saw him before they knew his story. Before he could respond, a young boy in the stands called out, "Hey, that's Marcus Johnson." The crowd buzzed with recognition. Whispers turned into exclamations as more people began to realize who was at the center of the confrontation. Some shouted words of support, while others watched in stunned silence, waiting to see how it would unfold. The guards exchanged confused glances, clearly not recognizing Marcus's name. But Marcus didn't need their validation. He turned to the crowd, giving a small wave and a nod, acknowledging their support without losing his composure. Then, with a calm yet powerful voice, he addressed the guards. "I was trying to avoid making this a scene," he began, his tone measured but firm. "But since you insist on treating me like I don't belong here, let me make it clear. I'm not just a fan. I'm not trespassing. I'm Marcus Johnson, the owner of this team." The lead guard froze, his expression shifting from irritation to disbelief. The second guard stammered, "You're the owner." Marcus nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, and while I appreciate your commitment to security, I suggest you double-check before assuming who belongs where." The moment hung in the air, thick with tension and unspoken words. The guards didn't know how to respond, and the crowd was on edge, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the anticipation of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what this moment represented. What would happen next would leave everyone in the stadium talking, but for now, the question lingered in the air. How would they respond to learning the truth? The silence that followed Marcus's declaration was almost deafening. The security guards stared at him, their expressions shifting between confusion and disbelief. It was clear they hadn't expected this twist. The lead guard's radio crackled softly, breaking the silence, but he didn't move. The weight of the moment had rendered him speechless. The crowd, however, wasn't so quiet anymore. Whispers quickly turned into murmurs, then into a rising wave of chatter. "He's the owner," someone said in astonishment. "No way." Another voice chimed in. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, their disbelief mingled with a newfound curiosity. Some people clapped, others nodded in approval, and a few simply looked stunned, their phones still pointed in his direction. Marcus didn't flinch. He had learned long ago how to stay composed in moments like this, how to let the gravity of his presence do the talking. But inside, he felt the familiar sting of frustration. It wasn't the first time he had been underestimated, dismissed, or treated as though he didn't belong. And deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the last. Still, there was something about this moment, the fact that it was happening in his own stadium, a place he had worked so hard to build, that made it cut a little deeper. "I didn't know," the lead guard finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson." Marcus raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "It's not about you knowing who I am," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about the way you assumed I didn't belong without asking any questions. Do you treat everyone like that? Or just people who look like me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. The guard's face flushed, and he looked down, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. The second guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could disappear. But Marcus wasn't interested in humiliating them. He wanted them, and everyone watching, to understand that this wasn't just about a single incident. It was about a pattern, one that too many people like him had experienced over and over again. As the guards stood there, struggling to respond, Marcus turned his attention to the crowd. He could see a mix of emotions in their faces: support, shame, anger, even admiration. And he knew that this moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone in that stadium, everyone watching from their phones, and everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he spoke, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "This stadium is more than just a building to me," he began. "It's a symbol of what's possible when you refuse to let the world define you. When you refuse to let anyone tell you where you belong or where you don't." The crowd quieted, hanging on his every word. Even the guards seemed transfixed, their earlier defensiveness replaced with something that looked a lot like regret. "I didn't build this place for people like me to be questioned or dismissed," Marcus continued. "I built it for people like me to feel seen, valued, and respected. And I'll keep fighting for that, no matter how many times moments like this happen." As Marcus spoke, his mind flashed back to the journey that had brought him here. He thought about his childhood, growing up in a small apartment with his mother, who had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. He thought about the countless nights he had spent watching football with his friends, dreaming of one day being a part of the game in a way that felt impossible. He thought about the people who had doubted him, the doors that had been slammed in his face, and the long hours he had spent proving to himself and the world that he was capable of more. It hadn't been an easy road. There were moments when he had wanted to give up, when the weight of the world felt too heavy to carry. But every time he had felt like quitting, he had reminded himself why he was doing it. For his family, for his community, for the next generation of kids who would grow up dreaming of a future that felt out of reach. And now, standing in the middle of his own stadium, Marcus couldn't help but feel the bittersweet irony of the moment. He had achieved more than he had ever imagined, yet here he was, still having to prove himself to people who couldn't, or wouldn't, see him for who he really was. The sound of applause broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. It started with a few people, then grew, until the entire section of the stadium was clapping, cheering, and even chanting his name. Marcus felt a surge of emotion, but he kept his composure, offering the crowd a small nod of gratitude. The lead guard, still looking uncomfortable, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice strained. "I am truly sorry for the misunderstanding. I didn't mean." Marcus held up a hand again, cutting him off. "It's not about apologies," he said. "It's about learning. About doing better next time. Can you promise me that?" The guard nodded quickly, his face earnest. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." "Good," Marcus said, his tone softening just slightly. "Then let's leave it at that." With that, Marcus turned and began walking back toward his private box, the crowd parting to let him pass. The applause followed him, growing louder with each step. But even as he moved away from the field, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment wasn't over. Not really. Back in his box, Marcus sat down and stared out at the field, the players now deep into the third quarter. The game continued as if nothing had happened, but Marcus knew better. The incident on the sidelines would ripple far beyond this stadium. Videos of the confrontation were already circulating online, and he could imagine the headlines that would follow. Some people would support him, praising him for standing his ground and using the moment to make a statement. Others would criticize him, accusing him of making it about race or blowing the situation out of proportion. But Marcus wasn't worried about the opinions of strangers. He was thinking about the people who would see those videos and feel a spark of recognition. The young kids who would see someone who looked like them standing tall in the face of adversity. The adults who had lived through similar experiences and felt validated by his response. And even the skeptics who might just be forced to reconsider their assumptions about who belongs where. For Marcus, that was what mattered most. Not the headlines, not the applause, not even the apologies. It was the possibility that this moment could be a catalyst for change, however small. As the final quarter began, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his mind already racing with ideas for how to turn this moment into something meaningful. There was still so much work to be done, both on and off the field. But if there was one thing Marcus knew, it was that he was ready for the challenge. After all, he had been proving people wrong his entire life. And tonight was no different. As Marcus sat in his private box, the cheers of the crowd and the distant sound of the game seemed muffled, like they were coming from another world. His mind wasn't on the game anymore. It was on what had just unfolded down on the sidelines. The tension of the moment lingered, weaving itself into his thoughts. He could feel it in the air, in the way the stadium seemed alive with whispers and speculation. From his elevated seat, he watched the fans below. Groups of people were still huddled together, talking animatedly, likely recounting the scene they had just witnessed. A few were pointing up at the box, their expressions a mix of curiosity and admiration. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, trying to gather his thoughts. This wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what it meant. Marcus's phone buzzed on the small table beside him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a text from his assistant leader. **** videos are already trending. Do you want to respond ****? He sighed, his thumb hovering over the screen. He knew this moment would blow up online. It was inevitable. In today's world, nothing stayed in one place, especially not a confrontation like this. It didn't matter that he'd handled it calmly, with dignity. The internet had a way of twisting things, of amplifying moments until they became something else entirely. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. Another buzz, this time a call. It was Leela again. He hesitated, then answered. "Marcus," Leela said, her voice calm but urgent. "This thing is already picking up steam. Social media's on fire. Some people are calling you a hero. Others are—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Well, you know how it goes. They're questioning why you didn't just tell the guards who you were right away." Marcus rubbed his temple, the familiar ache of frustration creeping in. "Of course they are," he muttered. "It's easier for them to question my actions than to question why the guards assumed I didn't belong in the first place." "I know," Leila said gently. "But this could get bigger. Reporters are already asking for statements. Do you want me to handle it?" Marcus sighed again, his eyes fixed on the field below. The players were locked in intense play, the crowd erupting in cheers as a touchdown was scored. He barely registered it. "No," he said finally, "not yet. Let's wait and see how it plays out. I don't want to speak just for the sake of speaking." Lila hesitated, then agreed. "Okay, but let me know if you change your mind." After hanging up, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. The truth was, he didn't know how he wanted to handle this. Part of him wanted to let it go, to focus on the bigger picture, and not let one incident overshadow everything he had worked for. But another part of him, the part that remembered all the times he'd been dismissed, overlooked or underestimated, felt like this moment needed to be addressed. Not for his sake, but for the countless others who faced the same kind of treatment every day. Meanwhile, down in the crowd, the ripple effects of the incident were still unfolding. In one section, a young woman named Tasha sat with her little brother, Malik. They had been watching the game when the confrontation broke out, and Tasha had been one of the first to recognize Marcus. She'd seen his face on TV before, heard about his journey from humble beginnings to owning a football team. For her, Marcus was more than just a successful businessman. He was proof that people like her and Malik could dream big. Malik, who was only 10, had been full of questions. Why were they so mean to him? He had asked, his small voice tinged with confusion and anger. He didn't do anything wrong. Tasha had struggled to find the right words to explain it. How do you tell a 10-year-old that sometimes people make judgments based on how you look, not who you are? How do you prepare him for a world that might not always see his worth? As they sat there now, watching the game, but still thinking about what had happened, Tasha found herself wishing she could do something. She didn't have Marcus's platform or influence, but she wanted to make sure Malik understood that what they had seen wasn't okay, and that it wasn't the end of the story. Across the stadium, another conversation was unfolding. The lead security guard, John, was standing near the entrance to the field, still reeling from the confrontation. He had been working in stadium security for over a decade, and nothing like this had ever happened before. He prided himself on doing his job well, on keeping the stadium safe for fans and players alike. But tonight, for the first time, he was questioning himself. He replayed the moment in his mind over and over. The way he had approached Marcus, the assumptions he had made, the tone he had used. At the time, it had felt like he was just doing his job. But now, in hindsight, he could see the bigger picture. He hadn't just misjudged a situation, he had misjudged a person. And not just any person, but someone who had built this stadium, who had worked to create the very space he was trying to protect. John's colleague Paul walked over, looking equally shaken. "Man," Paul said, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe that happened. Do you think he's going to fire us?" John shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But honestly, that's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about what it says about us. About how we do our jobs." Paul frowned. "You think we were wrong?" John sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I think we could have handled it differently. That's all I'm saying." The two men stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them. For John, this wasn't just about Marcus. It was about every person who had ever walked into this stadium and felt like they didn't belong. and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been a part of the problem. Back in his private box, Marcus was still deep in thought when there was a knock at the door. He turned to see his head coach Derek standing in the doorway. Derek, a former player who had known Marcus for years, stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" Derek asked, his voice low. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Yeah," he said, just processing. Derek sat down across from him, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "I saw what happened," he said. The whole team did. They're talking about it in the locker room. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What are they saying?" Derek shrugged. "They're proud of you. They're angry too. But mostly, they're proud." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He had built this team not just to win games, but to create a culture of respect, unity, and resilience. Hearing that his players supported him meant more than he could say. "Thanks, Derek," Marcus said, his voice quiet. "That means a lot." Derek nodded, his expression serious. "You're more than just the owner to these guys, Marcus. You're a symbol, and not just to them, to everyone in the stadium. Don't forget that." Marcus didn't respond right away. He knew Derek was right, but the weight of that responsibility wasn't easy to carry. Still, as he sat there, surrounded by the noise of the game and the murmur of the crowd, he felt a spark of determination. This wasn't just a moment to endure, it was a moment to use, and he wasn't going to let it pass without doing something meaningful. The weight of the moment grew heavier as the night deepened. Marcus sat in his private box, the sounds of the game filtering through the glass, but barely registering in his mind. Derek's words echoed in his thoughts. Asterisk, you're a symbol, asterisk. He had heard similar sentiments before. But tonight, they'd felt sharper, more immediate. The incident on the sidelines had become something much bigger than he anticipated, and Marcus could feel the tension stretching beyond the stadium walls. His phone buzzed again, this time with notifications flooding his screen. Clips of the confrontation had gone viral. There were hashtags with his name, debates unfolding in real time, and comment sections filled with praise, outrage, and everything in between. Some called the incident a wake-up call about the assumptions people make, while others argued over whether Marcus had overreacted or underplayed the moment. The noise was deafening, even from behind a screen. Marcus knew he couldn't stay in his box forever. This wasn't the kind of moment he could avoid or let quietly fade. He needed to step into the storm, to address the questions and tensions swirling around the incident. But how? Every word, every action would be scrutinized, dissected, and turned into soundbites. He had to get it right, not for his image, but for everyone watching who saw themselves in him. Meanwhile, down on the field, the game continued with electric intensity. The home team was trailing by a single touchdown, the crowd growing more raucous with each passing minute. Players exchanged glances as they passed the sidelines, whispers of the earlier incident weaving through the team like an undercurrent. Even the opposing players seemed aware, casting occasional looks toward the private boxes as though trying to catch a glimpse of Marcus. In the locker room, the atmosphere was charged. Several players gathered in small groups, their voices low but urgent. For them, Marcus wasn't just their boss. He was someone who had earned their respect in ways that extended far beyond the game. Players like Jermel, who had grown up in a tough neighborhood, saw Marcus as a living example of what was possible, and tonight's events had stirred something deep in him. He handled it like a boss, Jermel said, pacing near his locker. But man, it's still messed up. How do they not know who he is in his own house? Another player, Trey, nodded in agreement. It's not just about him, though, Trey said. It's about all of us. You'd think this would have gone down the same way if it were someone else. Someone who didn't look like him. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. The players knew the answer, even if no one said it aloud. For them, this wasn't just a moment. It was a reflection of the world they lived in every day, on and off the field. Outside the stadium, the scene was just as charged. Reporters had gathered near the entrances, their cameras and microphones poised for any scraps of information. Fans leaving the game were stopped for interviews, Their reactions split between admiration for Marcus's composure and outrage at the incident itself. A few die-hard supporters had even begun chanting Marcus's name, their voices cutting through the cool night air. Back in his box, Marcus finally stood up, his decision made. He wasn't going to wait for the media to twist the story into something it wasn't. He needed to take control, to speak his truth before the narrative got away from him. With a steadying breath, he opened the door to his suite and stepped into the hallway where Leela was waiting. "You ready?" she asked, her tone serious but supportive. "As ready as I'll ever be," Marcus replied. Together, they made their way toward the press room, the sound of their footsteps echoing down the corridor. Word had already spread that Marcus was going to address the incident, and by the time they arrived, the room was packed with reporters, team staff, and even a few players who had slipped in to watch. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of anticipation and tension. Cameras flashed as Marcus stepped up to the podium, his expression calm but resolute. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, every microphone aimed in his direction. But instead of intimidation, he felt a strange sense of clarity. This was his moment to take the narrative into his own hands. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. "Before I say anything else, I want to acknowledge the incredible game happening out there tonight. Our team is playing with heart, and I couldn't be prouder of them. But as many of you know, something else happened tonight that needs to be addressed." The room fell silent, every person hanging on his words. Marcus took a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle before continuing. "Tonight, I was stopped on the sidelines by security," he said, his tone measured. "They didn't know who I was, and they made assumptions about me that led to a confrontation. I want to be clear, this isn't about me. It's about what this moment represents. It's about the countless people who face these kinds of assumptions every single day, often with far worse outcomes." As Marcus spoke, the tension in the room shifted, replaced by a deeper and more thoughtful energy. He wasn't just recounting what had happened, he was reframing it, turning it into a conversation about larger issues. "This stadium is a place where people come together," Marcus continued. "It's a space for community, for celebration, for breaking down barriers. But tonight, we were reminded that those barriers still exist even here. And that's something we need to confront, not just as a team, but as a society." The reporters scribbled furiously, their pens flying across their notepads. Cameras zoomed in on Marcus's face, capturing every nuance of his expression. But Marcus wasn't performing for them. He was speaking for the people who couldn't be in that room, for the voices that often went unheard. "And let me be clear," Marcus added, his tone firm. "This isn't about blame. It's about learning, about doing better. For the security team, for our staff, for everyone in this stadium, myself included, because we all have a responsibility to create a world where moments like this don't happen." The room erupted into questions, reporters shouting over one another in their eagerness to get a response. But Marcus held up a hand, silencing them with a calm but commanding gesture. "I'll take your questions in a moment," he said. "But first, I want to say one last thing. This isn't the end of the conversation. It's just the beginning. And I promise you, I'll be doing everything in my power to make sure this moment leads to real change." With that, Marcus stepped back from the podium, the room buzzing with energy. The tension that had been building all night reached its peak, every person in the stadium, and beyond, waiting to see what would happen next. The press room buzzed with activity as Marcus stepped away from the podium, his carefully chosen words lingering in the air like an unspoken challenge. Reporters continued shouting questions, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. Marcus exchanged a brief glance with Leela, who gave him a subtle nod. The hardest part was over, or so he thought. As they turned to leave, a commotion erupted near the back of the room. A man in a dark suit pushed through the crowd, his voice cutting through the noise. "Wait, Marcus, before you go, there's something you should know." The room fell silent, the tension snapping back into place. Marcus stopped mid-step and turned, his eyes narrowing as the man approached. It was James Porter, a journalist known for his investigative reporting. He wasn't one to show up unless there was a story worth chasing, and the urgency in his voice made it clear he had found one. "James," Marcus said, his tone even but cautious. "What's on your mind?" Porter hesitated for a split second, as if weighing his next words. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to draw Marcus in without shutting out the room. "There's more to this than a misunderstanding on the sidelines," he said. "I've been digging into the stadium's operations, and I've uncovered something you need to see. It's bigger than tonight. Much bigger." Marcus's stomach tightened. The night had already taken enough unexpected turns, but this was different. Porter's reputation preceded him. He wasn't the type to chase petty scandals or gossip. If he was here, it meant there was substance to what he was saying. "What are you talking about?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity and concern. Porter glanced around, his eyes scanning the room before he spoke again. "It's not safe to get into it here. But let's just say tonight's incident might not have been an accident. There are forces at play, people, who don't want you here. And they're willing to go to great lengths to make sure you feel unwelcome." The room erupted again, reporters scrambling to piece together what Porter had just implied. Cameras flashed as questions flew in Marcus's direction, each one more pressing than the last. But Marcus didn't hear them. His mind raced, turning over Porter's words. Who didn't want him here? And why? Lila touched his arm gently, her voice low and urgent. "We should go," she said. "If Porter has something, we need to hear it, but not here." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening as he turned to leave. The noise of the press room followed him down the corridor, but his focus was elsewhere. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the stakes rising with every step he took. Whatever Porter had uncovered, it wasn't just about tonight. It was about something deeper, something that threatened everything Marcus had built. As they reached his office, Marcus closed the door behind them, the noise of the stadium fading into an eerie silence. Porter pulled out a folder, thick with documents and photos, and placed it on the table. "This," Porter said, tapping the folder, "is what I found. Financial records, internal memos, security reports. It all points to a coordinated effort to undermine your position as owner. They've been planting doubts, spreading rumors, even influencing key decisions. Tonight's incident was just the latest move, a way to humiliate you publicly, to make you question your place here." Marcus opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. The evidence was damning. There were emails between high-ranking officials, their language veiled but unmistakable in its intent. Mentions of shifting perceptions and restoring tradition hinted at an agenda that went beyond simple business strategy. "What tradition?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp. Porter met his gaze, his expression grim. "The tradition of ownership looking a certain way, of people like you not having a seat at the table." Leila's face hardened, her jaw tightening as she processed the implications. "So they've been trying to push him out," she said, her voice low but steady. "Why now? Why not when he first bought the team?" "Because back then he was new," Porter explained. "An unknown quantity. But now, you've proven yourself, Marcus. The team's thriving, the stadium's packed every week, and the fans love you. That kind of success makes people nervous, especially people who think power belongs to them." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. This wasn't just about business, it was personal. And it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever dared to break barriers, to challenge the status quo. "What do we do now?" Lila asked, her eyes locked on Marcus. Marcus didn't answer right away. He stared at the folder, the weight of its contents sinking in. He could feel the fight ahead, the battles he would have to wage, not just for himself, but for the legacy he was building, for the people who looked up to him, for the future he wanted to create. Finally, he stood, his resolve hardening. "We fight," he said, his voice firm. "We don't let them win." But even as he spoke, Marcus knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The forces against him were powerful, their motives rooted in years of unchallenged control. And as the night wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the real battle was yet to come. The days following that chaotic night at the stadium were a whirlwind. Marcus worked tirelessly, using every resource at his disposal to address the storm Porter's revelations had unleashed. Legal teams were brought in, PR strategies were devised, and allies both inside and outside the organization rallied behind him. The folder Porter had given him wasn't just a weapon. It was a map, pointing to the people and systems working against him. But even as Marcus pushed forward, the stakes kept rising. Every step he took was met with resistance, the shadowy opposition growing bolder, their moves more desperate. A week later, the stadium was filled once again, this time for a press conference called by Marcus himself. The air was thick with anticipation, the city's eyes glued to their screens as cameras zoomed in on Marcus, standing confidently at the podium. Behind him, a large screen displayed excerpts from the documents Porter had uncovered. Names, dates, and actions laid bare for all to see. "This isn't just about me," Marcus began, his voice calm but charged with determination. "What we're talking about here is bigger than football, bigger than one team or one owner. This is about a system that resists change, that clings to outdated notions of who belongs where. Tonight, we take a stand, not just for the future of this team, but for the future of the game and the community it represents." The crowd in the stadium erupted into applause, but Marcus wasn't finished. He stepped aside as the screen behind him shifted to a live feed from the league's headquarters. A panel of officials sat solemnly, their expressions grave. One by one, they addressed the findings Marcus had brought to light, confirming that an investigation had been launched and action would be taken against those involved. The atmosphere was electric. Marcus had not only exposed the conspiracy against him, but forced the league to confront its own flaws. For a brief moment, it felt like the battle was won. But then, just as the press conference was winding down, the twist came. As Marcus stepped off the podium, a man emerged from the crowd, moving with purpose. At first, no one paid him much attention, but then he called out Marcus's name, his voice clear and commanding. Marcus turned, and his expression shifted from calm to wary as he recognized the man. Richard Banks, a former majority owner of the team, and one of the most vocal critics of Marcus' leadership. "I have something to say," Richard declared, stepping forward. The cameras turned to him, the microphones picking up every word. "You've done an impressive job tonight, Marcus. You've exposed a system that's long overdue for change. But there's one thing you haven't told these people. One thing they deserve to know." The crowd hushed, every ear straining to catch his words. Marcus stayed silent, his eyes locked on Richard, a mix of caution and curiosity in his gaze. Richard paused, then continued. "The truth is, Marcus didn't just fight his way into ownership. He had help. Help from someone inside the very system he's exposing now. Someone who believed in him enough to risk everything to give him a shot." The revelation sent a ripple through the crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire as people tried to make sense of what Richard was saying. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained composed, waiting for Richard to explain himself. "Years ago," Richard went on, "I was approached by someone who believed Marcus was the right person to take this team to new heights. They convinced me to sell my shares, not just for the money, but for the future they saw in him. That person isn't here tonight, but their vision is. And while Marcus has earned his place, I think it's only fair to acknowledge how he got here." The twist landed like a thunderclap. The media erupted with questions, their cameras swinging wildly between Marcus and Richard. For Marcus, the moment was bittersweet. He had always known his journey wasn't one of pure independence, but hearing it revealed this way felt like a sudden crack in the narrative he had worked so hard to build. Yet, as the initial shock wore off, Marcus stepped forward, taking the microphone again. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with conviction. "Richard's right," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "No one achieves greatness alone. Along the way, there are people who believe in you, who see something in you that you might not even see in yourself. I've never claimed to have done this alone, and I never will. But let's not lose sight of what tonight is about. It's about dismantling the barriers that prevent more people from getting that chance. It's about ensuring that the next person who looks like me doesn't need a miracle or a secret ally to succeed. They'll succeed because the system will finally be fair. The room fell silent, Marcus's words cutting through the noise like a blade. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his steady breathing and the weight of his message hanging in the air. Then slowly the applause began. It started with a few scattered claps, but soon it grew into a roaring ovation, the sound reverberating through the stadium. As Marcus stepped away from the podium for the final time, he felt a sense of closure. The battle wasn't over. There was still work to be done, barriers to be broken, and minds to be changed. But tonight he had won an important victory, not just for himself, but for everyone watching who dared to dream of a better future. And as the cameras captured his quiet smile, a text buzzed on his phone. It was from Porter. Asterisk well played, but stay ready. The next chapter's already writing itself. Asterisk. Marcus tucked the phone back into his pocket, a knowing look in his eyes. The journey was far from over, but for now he would savor the moment, ready for whatever came next.